What a pleasure to be here for the Collision Conference. You know, something I look forward to when I come back to the school twice a year. It's one of the highlights of my year to be here, to engage with you guys, and what a pleasure it always is. Some of the best questions, and what I've really enjoyed, and I hope this is something you've enjoyed as well, is that when I'm here on the weekly basis, twice a year, I get to know you guys. And I realize college is one of these areas where it's a little bit transient because you're here for 4 years or longer if you're not doing the 4-year plan, and then you go. And I get to see people come and go, but I get to see some familiar faces as well. And folks who stay and then transfer out or who come, whatever it is, I really enjoy the relationships, and I hope you enjoy those as well, because sometimes our deepest discussions aren't had with me on this platform. They're had with you guys in the classrooms or at Doc Lacey's or whatever it can be, where we just happen to see each other as we're walking across campus. So please do stop me, and if you want to talk about something, I'm very open to doing that. Oftentimes I look like I'm busy, I gotta get to the next thing, and that's probably true because they fill my schedule pretty good when I'm here. But I also want to make that time to meet with you guys personally, and what a joy it's been to be a part of that effort and then part of this conference as well. So stop us, any one of us, Joe, Sean, and I are very much willing to talk with you guys. My topic for today is bringing clarity in a culture of confusion. Now, something happened to me about a year and a half ago or so that sort of is really, I think, illustrative of what we're seeing today in the culture. I was asked to speak at a place in Canada, and because I come from Michigan, I had this weird situation where Canada is actually the country to my south. Is that there's a Canadian peninsula that comes down into the by the United States, and it's actually south of Detroit, where I live. So I would go south into Canada, but this one happened to be directly west of me, so I had to cross a river to get to Canada. And it was about a drive from my house, not a very far-speaking engagement. Usually I'm on like these ridiculously long flights, but this one was much shorter. So I had to drive across over to Canada, but there was a car ferry that would take my car across the river. Now, it's not a big river, it's a pretty sort of narrow river, but it's not so narrow that a bridge would make any kind of sense, so they put a car ferry there. So I pull up to this car ferry, and the whole thing, now I've been on a lot of car ferries, I live in the Great Lakes region, so there's lots of car ferries, and they're typically big. They fit like 15, 16, sometimes 30 cars on them, and they're huge. And you get into the car ferry, you get out of your car, go up on deck, and kind of enjoy the sort of the little journey there. This car ferry was barely bigger than the car. I could only fit me on there. Maybe 2 cars could fit on this thing at all. So I get onto the car ferry, and the guy says, stay in your car, don't get out of the car, it's gonna be a short ride, don't worry about it. I said, fine, great. Well, as we began to disembark from the dock, I looked down at my GPS. I wanted to make sure that the address I had in Canada was the right one, and that I was gonna be, when I crossed the river, it would still work and pick up my route from right there. So I looked down at the GPS just as we were leaving. So I didn't see us leave the dock. Now, because I was still in the car, I couldn't feel us leave the dock. The suspension of the car and the weight of the car prevented me from feeling that jerk motion that happens when a boat leaves the dock. So I couldn't see us leave the dock, and I couldn't feel us leave the dock. So then I looked up, and the river was always moving. That's why it's a river. I couldn't see if we were moving or not. I had a subtle feeling that we were moving, but I couldn't see if we were moving. I looked at the boat, and the boat couldn't help me because I was on the boat. And if I'm moving, then the boat is moving. And if I'm still, the boat's still. That's not going to help me either. So you had that feeling before where you're sitting at a street corner or you're sitting at a stopped car and the bus next to you moves and you don't know if you're moving or if it's moving? And you had that momentary sort of nausea that overtakes you, and you're like, what do I do? What do you do in that instance? You look to something that's not moving. You look to a sure foundation, maybe a street lamp, whatever it was. Well, I was in a river. So if I was moving and the river was moving, I had no point of reference, no way to bear on whether I was moving or not. So this nausea was actually pretty intense. That's what seasickness actually is, the inability to know if you're moving or if the water is moving. I had to find something that was fixed, so I looked across the river and I could see the land. The land was fixed. It wasn't moving. And that's when I suddenly got rid of my vertigo. All that nausea sort of went away in a flash because I looked to see what was sure. I'm convinced, based on the things we see today in our society, whether it's the various things that are happening in the Middle East. I mean, look, I'm from the Middle East, and I follow the conflict about what's happening in the Middle East. I'm confused by it. I don't know who's mad at who and for what. Do you have any ideas? Because it's pretty confusing all by itself. That's an area of confusion. We're talking about gender issues and sexuality and all these things. That's confusing. Things that we once thought were immovable, immutable, not changeable, are now up for grabs. We can change whatever we want. Think of the moral questions we're asking ourselves. Think of the racial animus that we're still dealing with in this country. All these various things, we seem to be in the river and unable to tell if we're moving frontwards, backwards, sideways, or whatever ways. We have no sure foundations. All these questions that have brought about a term of confusion or a sense of confusion. Issues on the nature of death. Should we let doctors assist people in ending their lives? Should people be able to do that or not? I don't know how it's going to work out, how it's going to play out medically, but all these questions, when does life begin? All these things we once took for granted, we don't take for granted anymore. We're now immersed in the culture of confusion. It reminds me of a song. And you probably heard me say this before, if you've heard me speak at chapel before. I think it speaks so clearly to what we're seeing now. I said it a couple of years ago, standing on this very stage, and now I think it's actually coming to fruition. In the 1980s, when I was growing up, the band Genesis had a song called Land of Confusion. And back then, the issue was whether or not the United States and the USSR would actually annihilate each other in some kind of a nuclear war. And it was about the land of confusion. But now it seems to apply not in terms of war, but in terms of the culture itself. Will the culture eat itself? Is that going to happen? And everyone's trying to say, I have the answers. I'm going to be your champion. I'm going to be your Superman. You can follow me. I have the answers. And the words of the song go like this. It says, oh, Superman, where are you now when everything's gone wrong somehow? These men of steel, these men of power are losing control by the hour. And you ask yourself the question, amidst all the voices that are out there, we have no shortage of voices, whether it's on social media, whether it's on the news channels, wherever it might be, there's no shortage of voices of people saying that I have the answer, I'm the men of steel, follow me. Do you feel any more secure? Do you feel any less confused? Or is it because all of the voices that are there, you actually feel more confused? And the thing is this, we are now living in a culture, I'm convinced, that while we decry all the loss of control, because these supermen and these men of steel are losing control by the hour, we decry that and say that's terrible. We actually celebrate the cause. We're happy with the cause of the confusion because we want to be a law unto ourselves. We seem to like being confused as a culture. It's the new thing. It's the new vogue to be confused. Think about this. If you're confused sexually, you're progressive. If you're confused morally, you're open-minded. If you're confused religiously or spiritually, you are inclusive and tolerant. But if you're clear sexually, you're a bigot. If you're clear morally, you're narrow-minded. And if you're clear spiritually, well, then you're intolerant. Do you see what's happened? Confusion has become a virtue, and clarity has become a sin. It's become this way. This is the culture we're in now. In fact, Oxford English dictionaries, every year they come out what's called their word of the year. Now, the word of the year doesn't have to be a new word. It simply has to be a word that actually sort of encapsulates the culture, the mood of the culture at the time for that previous year. And in November, I believe it was, maybe even a little earlier, Oxford English dictionaries named their word of the year, and it was post-truth. Now, post-truth's not a new word. I think it was coined for the first time in 1992. But a post-truth society, the definition is one that values and elevates preferences and feelings over facts and truth. It elevates preferences and feelings over facts and truth. Now, that's very sharply distinct from a postmodern society. A postmodern society says that there is no such thing as objective truth. All truth is relative. So your truth and my truth might be in conflict, but if I keep my truth to myself and you keep your truth to yourself, we won't bump into each other, but there is no such thing as objective truth. We don't have to worry about that. That's a postmodern idea, and that has ebbed and flowed down through the centuries, but it has begun to die its death. What's replacing it is a post-truth culture. A post-truth culture doesn't deny that truth exists. It actually says truth exists, and we don't care. Our preferences matter more than the actual truth does. Why has this happened? And you begin to see this, by the way, where we begin to look at the things that were once standards in our lives. For example, the Bible. You have Christians who are looking at the Bible and saying, I'm going to reinterpret what it says. What it says and clearly says to fix and sort of match up with my preferences, whether it be sexual preferences, whether it be moral preferences, whether it be social justice preferences. We're going to twist the words enough to make it fit what I want it to say, not what it actually says. That's what's happening in religious cultures. But then we're seeing people eschew it all together and say, we don't want that because that interferes with my preferences. I have certain preferences of some kind, whether it's political or social, whatever it is, and this doesn't fit it, so I'm going to reject it, even though I know it might be true. That's what a post-truth culture is. See, here's the problem. We're living in a culture of confusion because we have sacrificed clarity and truth on the altar of unfettered human autonomy. We have sacrificed truth on the altar of unfettered human autonomy. Now, what do I mean by this? What do I mean? When I say unfettered human autonomy, something is fettered if it's chained to something else, if it's actually got some level of restraint to it. Autonomy we think of as freedom. It is not the same thing as freedom. Autonomy comes from two root words, autos meaning self, and nomos meaning law. Autonomy is when you become a law unto yourself. Now here's the problem with that. It sounds like it's a good idea or something like that. It's actually a terrible idea, because if you're a law unto yourself and you decide what's right and what's wrong for yourself, and I have a law unto myself and your law and my law happens to clash, who is the one who wins? In this culture, it's the one with the biggest or the loudest microphone. In other cultures, it's the one with the most guns or the biggest claws or whatever it might be. A society where you have unfettered human autonomy is simply unworkable, and we're headed toward that because we want to be the masters of our own destiny. We want to define what it means to be male or female. We want to define what it means to have sexual preferences. We want to define whether or not certain things are true or not, and those things matter for us. Whether certain things people lie about are important enough for us to care about. We want to do that because we want to have our unfettered human freedom. It's not even freedom. I wouldn't even say it's freedom. It's actually unfettered human autonomy. So the question we have to ask ourselves is this: is this going to lead us somewhere good or somewhere awful? And I think we can see that in the news. 24-hour, you've heard me say this before probably, 24-hour news is one of the worst inventions of the past 40 years. Because all you have to do with 24-hour, you can tell the story in about an hour and a half. The entire global news, you could tell in about an hour and a half if you just stuck to facts. But you can't just stick to facts because there's 23 or 22 and a half more hours in the day to fill. So you have to do is give it tons of opinion and tons of conjecture. And so that's one of the problems with 24-hour news. But it does give us this benefit. If you want to find out whether the culture of confusion is headed in a good direction, just turn on the television any hour of the day and you'll find out. Whether it's the Berkeley, California stuff that's happening, or the other universities where riots are taking place because we claim free speech, but we also shut it down as soon as we see it. Whatever it might be, we're headed toward a culture not only of confusion, but of utter chaos. How do you bring clarity, the clarity that we all need? Clarity helps to bring, I think, a sense of peace and a true understanding of what it means to be human and also what it means to have true freedom. How do you bring that in a culture that considers clarity to be a sin and confusion to be a virtue? How do you do that? I want to walk you through a couple of ways to do that and then talk about some of the benefits of bringing clarity to a culture of confusion. The first way you do this actually is to show the consequences through, I think, cordial conversations, but to show the consequences of what happens when you forsake or you sacrifice clarity and truth on the altar of human autonomy, where preferences are more important than facts. Let me give you an illustration of this. A number of years ago, I was giving a talk to a men's group at a men's breakfast on my conversion from Islam to Christianity. And as is characteristic of what I do typically is, I don't talk about the falsehood of my previous belief. I talk about the truth of my current belief. I fundamentally believe this. People don't reject their old worldviews and then embrace yours because their old worldview is false. All that leads to is them rejecting their old worldview. Maybe they become an atheist, maybe they become a Buddhist, maybe they become whatever. If you want to show them that the gospel is true, you have to show them that the gospel is actually true. That's the alternative to which they turn. So I focus my testimony typically on what is true about the gospel, not what's false about something else. The implication, of course, is that everything else is false. That's how truth works. That which is false is excluded. So I gave this talk, and there was a gentleman in the front, and he is copiously writing notes, just furiously writing notes the whole time I'm talking. I mean, the kind of notes where it looked like the page was going to burst into flame because of the friction and the speed at which his pen was crossing the page. It's like, this guy is going to be the first guy to ask me a question. I know it. And sure enough, as soon as I was done, he was the first guy to ask a question, asked a very intelligent question. We had a nice time. But then afterwards, he came up to me to talk to me after we were done. The Q&A was over, and he talked to me afterwards. And he said, I really appreciated what you said during your talk. Can I show you something? Now, if you're a public speaker, you know this. When someone says, can I show you something, it's going to be a very long discussion. And he came up to me, and he has this diagram he wrote. And in the diagram, he has this capital T right in the middle of the diagram. And then there are these lowercase t's surrounding the capital T. And all the lowercase t's are pointing towards the capital T. So you get the picture, there's a T in the middle of the page, and all these smaller t's that surround it, and their arrows are pointing towards the T. Well, he says, okay, there is such a thing as truth. So far, we're good. There is a thing as objective and total truth, but we don't know all of it yet. And I said, great, I'm with you so far. If I knew all the truth, I would be God. I'm clearly not God, so I don't know everything. So you and I are on the same page. Good, continue. He says, but all of us are lowercase t's. We all have a version of the truth. We just don't have all of the truth. And we're all going to get there eventually. That's where we differ. Like, all of us have a version of the truth? As incomplete as it might be, we all have a version of it. What he was trying to get at is that not everyone believes just a pack of lies. There's some truth in other worldviews. I agree with that. That's probably true. But we don't have versions of the truth. We might have fragments of it, but not versions of it. But he's saying we have versions. So he can't disagree with the Hindu or the Buddhist or anybody else. So I challenged him on it, and I said, well, let me ask you. I want to make sure I understand this. Are you telling me you can't disagree with anybody, like Pol Pot or Hitler? Or Mao Zedong, you're telling me these guys are okay with you? It's like, no. I can't tell you that I prefer their view. I don't prefer their version of the truth. But I can say that I can't disagree with it. And I said, sir, let me just tell you, if there's one person it's safe to disagree with, it's Hitler. No one gets offended when you say, I don't like Hitler. No one says, well, how dare you? You must like him, unless they're white supremacists of some kind. And that's a very small part of the population. It's safe to say that. You won't offend me. He said, no, I can't tell you I disagree because I can't disagree with anybody. I'm like, wait, let me make sure I'm clear on this. Are you telling me that you can't disagree with anybody? And he said, that's right. I said, sure you can. He said, no, I can't. I said, you just did it. Now, as a lawyer, I kind of set him up a little bit. I knew where this was going to go. I was, trained sort of to do this. And I wasn't trying to set him up to trap him necessarily, but you can kind of tell in certain conversations that certain people at some point are going to have to eat their words. And they're going to have to do it to themselves. And that's what happened with this guy. In his effort to say that all religions and all worldviews are basically the same, which sounds like a good thing, doesn't it? That's why people have bumper stickers on their cars that say coexist or tolerance or whatever, and it has all those symbols from other religious systems. He's trying very hard to say that all systems are basically the same, and in order to respect them all. In fact, he said that to me. He tries to respect all the systems. But the problem is when you sacrifice preference, his preference is not to conflict with anybody, to affirm everyone's beliefs. But the truth is, you can't possibly do that because in doing so, you don't affirm everyone's beliefs, you actually insult everyone's beliefs. I mean, I used to be a Muslim. I knew exactly what Muslims believe. They don't believe in a triune God. They reject the Trinity as blasphemous. That God became a man and died on a cross is blasphemous to a Muslim. So if you tell a Muslim, we all basically agree, but you believe that God is triune and that he died on a cross and rose from the dead again, you are saying to him, I don't take your worldview seriously enough to disagree with it. That's an insult. And I was talking to him about that. I call this giving someone the dignity of difference. If you differ with somebody, you're actually giving them dignity by saying, I take you seriously enough to say to you that I want to know your worldview and then understand that it actually begins to say something different than my worldview. You've all heard the phrase, all roads lead to God, right? You've all heard this phrase. Maybe you've even said this phrase, all roads lead to God. What's interesting about that is if you've studied all roads, you know they don't even claim to lead to God. In Islam, you don't get to go to God, you go to God's paradise. In Christianity, that is the point of existence, to be in communion with God. In Hinduism, it's not to go and be with God, it's to be God. And in Buddhism, as Buddha taught it, it is to become nothing. Four at least very different worldviews about what the ultimate destiny is. So when you say they all lead to God, you're actually not taking any of them seriously. You're insulting all of them. So when you sacrifice truth and logic on the altar of unfettered human freedom, on the idea of preference, post-truth says preference matters more and opinions matter more than truth. When you do that, you lose your ability to reason. And that's the first consequence of the culture of confusion without clarity, is you lose your ability to reason. That's number one. In fact, I remember I was walking out of that engagement and the guy was there by his car. As I was walking to my car, he was muttering to himself. He said, if I can't disagree with anybody but I disagree with him, then how can I disagree? He was doing that kind of to himself. Because he was recognizing that clarity is important and that truth will ultimately if you deny the truth, because you want to have everybody believe the same thing, it's going to clobber you and clobber you hard. But this doesn't have just conversational effects. Think about what we're seeing today, how we lose a sense of reason and logic. Not long ago, at the University of Missouri, there was a protest started by football players over alleged racial discrimination that was happening at the university. I don't know what happened there, and I didn't follow the story enough to know whether or not that actual racial animus existed or not. But football players had started it. It became a very large public protest. That's what protests are for, to be public, so the press comes and gets the word out. That's the whole point. That's why they're effective. Well, ESPN had sent a photojournalist there. Maybe you remember the story. It was on YouTube as well. What happened there? ESPN, because football players had started at the University of Missouri, sent a photojournalist, not a journalist to interview anybody, just a photo guy, to come to the university, an Asian man, I believe it was, to take pictures of the protest, the public protest. And while he was taking pictures of it, he happened to come across a quote-unquote safe space, which I'm not even sure what that means, but there they have it, a safe space. And as he was taking pictures, a woman comes in front of him and starts to push him away from the area and asks, she says on the camera, can we get some muscle over here to remove this aggressor? We need some muscle over here to get rid of this guy. A professor of journalism. How confused does the culture have to be where a professor of journalism who teaches people how to express their First Amendment rights to freedom of the press and freedom of speech come to kick a journalist out of a public protest by force? That is the culture of confusion I'm talking about. In a place like Berkeley, California, where there is a protest because a certain voice comes in, an unpopular voice in that campus comes in to speak. Whether you agree or disagree with his method or his message isn't the point. Berkeley is the place where the free speech movement in America started. And they rioted in the streets, breaking things, setting things on fire, and throwing objects and pepper spraying people to get him to not speak. Do you see the problem? The culture of confusion doesn't have just private implications, it has very public implications. We lose our ability to reason, and if we lose our ability to reason, we lose our ability to act reasonably. That's the first effect. We have to point that out. The second thing that happens when you sacrifice clarity on the altar of unfettered human autonomy is that you lose a sense of accountability and human value. Now, of course, centuries and centuries ago, Protagoras actually made the comment. He said, man is the measure of all things. If there's no transcendent authority above us, if there's no transcendent authority by which value is determined and by which the moral value is given, then it's all a matter of human opinion. The question was asked of Sean earlier today about what about cannibals? In some cultures they eat their neighbors, in some cultures they love their neighbors. Is there a matter of preference or is it a matter of truth? How do you become the arbiter of these things? If man is the measure of all things, one group of people happens to believe morality is one way, the other group of people happens to believe morality is another way. Who wins? It's not a matter of intellect and education. That doesn't always do it. What you have is a matter of force, essentially, and appeals to authority. The transcendent authority actually ground our views on some of these things. Without it, we are awash in a sea, much like I was on the river. Now, secular humanists will tell you that we do have a grounding for all these things. Listen to the words of Tom Flynn. Tom Flynn has written a lot of stuff on secular humanism, and he writes this about what a secular humanism, an atheistic worldview, has in mind. He says, secular humanism maintains that through a process of value inquiry informed by scientific and reflective thought, men and women can reach rough agreement concerning values, crafting ethical systems that deliver optimal results. That's interesting, optimal results. Sounds like you're building a computer. For human beings in a broad spectrum of circumstances. Did you catch what he said? Secular humanism maintains that through a process of value inquiry informed by scientific and reflective thought, men and women can reach rough agreement concerning values, ethical systems, and so on. Now, when you look back at the last century and 16 or 17 years, add a pen to what's happened in this century alone, you were to find something, that we have never been more educated than we are right now. We've never had better technology. We've never had more access to education, higher education of any kind throughout the world, especially in the West. And I want to ask yourself this question. Now that we've come together with scientific inquiry and reflective thought, have we crafted a better value system than before? All we've found is better ways and more efficient ways to kill each other from a distance. And look at somebody else, and because of their skin color or their religion or whatever it might be, and say, that person is less than me, and that person must be either subjugated or eliminated. That happens today. Did you know that modern slavery is actually more numerous than previous slavery? That right now, through the sex trade industry, there are 2 million people in slavery right now in the sex trade industry alone. Don't tell me it's over, no matter how educated we are. Tom Flynn says that we can come to rough agreement concerning values. So I want to ask you this. If you look into the face of Christians and Yazidis and Shiite Muslims who live in certain parts of the world, just ask them how rough that agreement actually is. Pretty rough. We're terrible at this. We are inherently terrible at this because we've lost that sense of clarity about where we come from and who we are. We want to be the masters of our own domain. And when we are laws unto ourselves, when we are fully autonomous, it results in the chaos we see today. Education doesn't do it. Reminds me of the poem by Alexander Pope in his Essays on Man. He says, "Go wiser thou in thy scale of sense, weigh thy opinion against providence. Say, here he gives too little and there too much. Call imperfect what thou fanciest such. Destroy all creatures for thy sport or gust. Yet cry, if man's unhappy, then God's unjust. If man alone engross not heaven's highest care, alone made perfect there, immortal here, snatch from his hand the balance and the rod, rejudge his justice, and be the judge of God." And then he says this, "Aspiring to be gods if angels fell, aspiring to be angels men rebel. Who but wishes to invert the laws of nature sins against the eternal cause." Hear what he's saying? He's saying that in our pride, we judge God for having not done good enough and thinking we can do better. And then when we don't do better, we blame God for it. Because we don't want to be with God. We don't want the communion. We want to reject him at all and say we are laws unto ourselves, and that inverts the laws of nature in so many ways, societally speaking, sexually speaking, morally speaking, in every way there can be, we invert these things. See, we've lost this idea of human intrinsic value because we've sacrificed clarity on the altar of human autonomy. What can be more shackling than having to take care of another person? What can be more shackling to your autonomy than that? And so what results is we have to say that certain people don't have value. This is not a new thing. And if you've been around long enough, you've heard people say this, maybe even you heard me say this. When you lose that sense of intrinsic value for human beings, they become a tool for you to be able to achieve what you want in your life. They have extrinsic value, not intrinsic value. That's actually a real thing that's happening in our universities today. Peter Singer, for example, is a bioethicist out of Princeton University. He makes the argument that parents should be able to kill their newborn babies up to a certain age because they can't value themselves. The baby has no sense of its own value. Only the parents can give it value. And if the parents don't give it value, then the baby doesn't have value and can be eliminated because it's in the way, in some way. He's not alone in this, by the way. Francesca Minerva and Alberto Giubilini in the Journal of Medical Ethics coming out of Australia have an article called Why Should the Baby Live? Where they argue for the exact same thing, that a mother or a father, usually the mother, has the right to determine whether a newborn, not preborn, not partially born, but a newborn baby should and can be eliminated based on its physical characteristics or whether it's just plain old inconvenient. Do you see what's happened? In our quest for autonomy, we are now saying who's valuable and who's not. We have lost that sense of accountability and human value in this quest for human autonomy and sacrificing clarity on the altar of these things. Those are just two examples of things that are bad, that are happening in a way that's just really, I think, unnerving the culture and unnerving things. Now, is there a way to actually bring clarity to a culture that seems to not want it? I think there is. Blaise Pascal said that men despise religion. They hate it and fear that it may be true. And the trick is to show them that religion is not contrary to reason, but worthy of reverence and respect. Next, make it attractive. Make good people wish it were true, and then show them that it is. Now, how do you do that in a culture that rejects clarity as a sin and confusion as a virtue? How do you do that? You find out what it is they care about and offer them the beauty and the depth that the gospel offers. So why are we embraced in a culture of confusion? Because we want human autonomy, unfettered human autonomy. We think that's freedom. We want that freedom. And people often reject the Bible because they think that the Bible is actually against freedom, that it says, don't do this for these reasons. You shouldn't do this because of this. Arbitrarily, don't love these people for these reasons or whatever it might be. So we see this sense of a stricture, of a constraint that the Bible has on us through its laws, and that's anti-freedom. And the reality is the Bible is not anti-freedom at all. The Bible is actually pro-freedom, but it does stand against human autonomy, the idea that you can be a law unto yourself. Why does it stand against that? Because it knows, the Bible being the inspired word of God, I believe, knows and tells us that you and I, when left to each other as laws unto ourselves, will eat each other. That's the law of nature, not the law of society. So it stands against unfettered human autonomy, but it doesn't stand against freedom. Now, freedom must have boundaries. In order for there to be true freedom, freedom must have boundaries. That's how freedom works. I'll give you an example of this. I live in an area where my house, my backyard, actually backs up to a main road. It's a main road behind my house. There's this lovely path, this little pathway at our house that people can ride their bikes on and run and all these things. Pardon me. If my kids didn't have boundaries when they were super young, knowing where you can and can't play, and you can't go further than this, if there was no boundaries for them, then they wouldn't be free to play in my backyard because I wouldn't let them play in the backyard because they wouldn't have the freedom. Maybe the ball would go into the street. Maybe they would cross that path and then get hit by a car or whatever. I'd be terrified to have them go into that backyard at all unless they respected the boundaries. Do you see what I'm saying to you? They wouldn't have had the freedom to play in that backyard if there were no boundaries for the backyard. Boundaries foster freedom, they don't hinder it. When they're sufficient, they don't have to be more than too much boundaries. They have to be enough boundaries to let you enjoy freedom. And that's what the Bible gives to you and to me. The laws that it has is contained in the Bible offer you and me the kinds of freedom that so we can enjoy, or the kind of boundaries so that we can enjoy true freedom in every way there is to enjoy freedom. The Bible's all about that, by the way. When you look from the beginning to the end, when Adam and Eve are created and they're put in that garden, they are there to have relationship with God, and they're given total freedom except for one thing. It was to not eat of a certain fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because they would be enslaved by their obsession to determine good and evil, and God knew that. So he forbid that one fruit from them, but he had to give them the choice to obey or disobey so they could enjoy the freedom of true relationship. And they were kicked out of the garden, and the whole story ever since then has been how to get us back to freedom. The captivity of the Jews by Egypt was all about liberating them from that so they could have the freedom to follow God instead of be bondage to a pagan culture. The Babylonian captivity, they go into captivity and into exile, but they're freed from that eventually. Over and over again, the Bible's claim is about freedom and deliverance from the real things that hinder us, not the Bible. The Bible is that which frees us from the things that are around us. And ultimately, Jesus claims to be that source of freedom. So people reject the Bible because they think it's against human freedom. It's not against human freedom. It's against human autonomy, but it's pro-freedom. And what is the greatest way to get that freedom? It's through the freedom that Christ offers to you and to me, the truest source of freedom. Let me sustain this for you by quoting from Jesus' words. In John chapter 8, verses 31 to 36. So Jesus said to the Jews who had believed him, "If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Truth has boundaries. Truth necessarily has boundaries because it excludes that which is false to it. And if truth has boundaries, then it also allows for freedom, which is why Jesus says, "And the truth will set you free." They answered him, "We are offspring of Abraham and have never been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say we will become free?" Jesus answered them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The son remains forever. So if the son sets you free, you will be free indeed." They were saying, how can you say we're not free? We're children of Abraham. Our tradition is what's there. And Jesus says, truth, not tradition, is what sets you free. And then he makes that remarkable statement. He says, the Son remains forever, so if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. I want you to carefully understand this now. He just got done saying that if you know the truth will set you free. And then he says, the Son will set you free, and free indeed. If the truth sets you free and the Son of God sets you free, the Son of God is the truth. Truth is not a path. It's not a process. It's a person, in whom is the embodiment of truth. See, the clarity of the Christian faith is rooted in who Jesus actually is, his identity, who he claimed to be. Who he claimed to be was the Son of God who came on earth to live the life that you and I can't live because you and I are sinful, but he is not. And he can bear your burdens because he's not sinful. And if that's the case, then he can bear those burdens and pay the price that you deserve. And then he dies. And the best thing about this is Jesus makes a truth claim. He says, I am the Son of God. And the Jews say, why should we believe you? And he says, if you destroy my body, I will raise it up again in 3 days. It's an objective truth. If it wasn't true, and he stayed dead, you can reject him, as Sean was saying this morning. If he stayed dead, then you can reject him because he claimed he wouldn't. But the historical resurrection actually proves that he did rise from the dead. And people often ask me the question, why do you believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life? And my answer is simple. He died and rose again, and someone who rises from the dead has credibility. I don't have credibility, I'm just some guy. But Jesus does, because he demonstrated his ability to do that. So that does a couple of things for us. If Jesus is the source of that hope, of that clarity, it gives us a couple of things. First, it gives us the clarity for the foundation of human value. The foundation of human value. How do you know how valuable something is? If you were to look at someone who doesn't believe in God, for example, and say, how do you know human beings are objectively valuable, independent of human opinion? They'd have to say, there is no such thing because all we have is human opinion. But if you were to say you have objective value, then there has to be some kind of an ontic referent, a reference outside of yourself that gives you that value. How do you know how valuable anything is? How do you know? I mean, there's things in my home that are incredibly valuable to me. Pictures of my wedding, DVDs of my kids' first birthdays, all these things, their talent shows, all this stuff is extraordinarily valuable to me. There's a fire in the house, it's going to burn and melt and go away. But if that's the case, I'm going to mourn the loss of those things. But I don't value them so much that I'm willing to make my kids fatherless over them. I'm not going to try to save them in the middle of a fire. But if one of my kids is in the house or my wife is in the house, you better believe I will risk everything so that they could live. My physical appearance, my very life. You know how valuable something is by what you're willing to pay for it. And God himself demonstrates your value and my value in that he says to you and to me that because you're made in my image, he comes to this earth to die for you. He pays an immeasurable price to show you the immeasurable value you have, because with that, you can spend an immeasurable eternity with him. It's remarkable. It's an objective statement of your value. The cross is not some historical oddity. It actually brings together all the things we search for, which is the value of human life. So where the culture of confusion denies or actually sacrifices human value, the gospel itself, the clear gospel, actually vouchsafes human value. But the power of the gospel also has the clarity enough to give us a spreading of hope. The culture of confusion, do you feel a sense of hope? In the culture of confusion, do you feel that sense that we're getting somewhere better than we were before? Or are things looking a little more bleak? It's the gospel that can provide this sense of hope. It can provide a sense of global hope. Mark Twain said it, that history does not repeat, but it does rhyme. And he's right about that. When you look at the way in which people who have the gospel-centered hope within them changed the Roman Empire, an empire that was once a republic, but you weren't given personhood by virtue of you being a born person. You had to earn personhood, or the state had to give you personhood. The Christian message is that we're all equally sinners, but we're all equally offered redemption in Christ and from the one who gives value. Not the state, not government, but the one who creates everything gives you that value. That gives you a sense of hope. And that's why Christians were changing the Roman Empire from within, from a brutal and dark place to a place where there could be equality eventually. That's why the slave trade ended in England and in the United States, because Christians said all people, regardless of where they come from, are created in God's image. And because of that, we have no right to violate them. Those changes happened there as well. So much so that Matthew Paris, who's an atheist actually, wrote these words. He's an atheist, and he comes from Africa, and he looks and sees what Christian work is doing in Africa, what the gospel of clarity actually does. Listen to what he says. He's not saying that the work that Christians do, the good deeds they do, fixes things. He's saying the clarity of the message they bring brings hope. This is what he says. Before Christmas, I returned after 45 years to the country that as a boy I knew as Nyasaland. Today it's Malawi. It inspired me, renewing my flagging faith in development charities. But traveling in Malawi reflects another belief too, one I've been trying to banish all my life, but an observation I've been unable to avoid since my African childhood. It confounds my beliefs, stubbornly refuses to fit my worldview, and has embarrassed my growing belief that there is no God. Now a confirmed atheist, I've become convinced of the enormous contribution Christian evangelism makes in Africa. Christian evangelism, spreading the message, makes in Africa. Sharply distinct from the work of secular NGOs, government projects, and international aid efforts. These alone will not do. Education and training alone will not do. In Africa, Christianity changes people's hearts. It brings spiritual transformation. The rebirth is real. The change is good. This is a non-Christian talking about what the clarity of the gospel does amid a culture of confusion. It brings that global hope. But then it offers a very personal hope to you and to me. Not just global, but very personal hope. Maybe you're struggling with something. I don't know. Everyone struggles with something sometime. And in an age where the confusion abounds, whether it's about your personal life or it's about the global scene in general, or a combination of the two, there's always that sense of struggle. In your studies, in your family relationships, in sports you're playing, whatever it might be. There's always that sense of a personal struggle. The gospel offers you and me hope because it clarifies for you who you actually are. Is that if you have body image issues, if you have gender identity issues, if you have issues regarding your sexual choices, whatever it is, the Bible tells you a clear statement, absolutely clear. It says you are made in God's image. And all the things you're confused about, you can be clear about that. You are made in God's image. And if you cling to that, there's a value to you and something that he offers you and to me that goes beyond all this. There was a girl, and I may have told you this story before, just south of here. I was at a university in this state, and she came up to a microphone at a public university and asked a question about sexuality. She was asking specifically about her situation and her homosexual lifestyle and wanted to know what Christianity had to say about this. By the time we were done talking, because I started with the premise that she, no matter what she says, believes, or does, is made in God's image, she began to see that the Bible is not in favor of institutions like marriage. It's in favor of her, and the institutions exist to benefit her, to give her true freedom. And as she stood there, listening to the answer, much longer than I just gave, she was crying her eyes out, and at the end of it, we prayed together, and she said this: "No one has ever told me I was made in God's image before." Culture of confusion caused her to walk up to that microphone trembling. The gospel of clarity caused her to leave that stage in tears, knowing that there's real hope. That hope is there. So how do you bring clarity to a culture of confusion? It's found in him, his identity, who he is. Not in something else, but in who he is. And when you find out what his identity is, the Bible says to you and to me that the whole point of you existing on this earth is relationship with God, and that you are to be conformed more and more to look like Christ. Not to look more and more like what you want to look like, but what you need to look like. And when you find that, there's a liberty in that, because the search is no longer something that you need to look into in terms of what you need to be like. You know it now because he is the template that you are following after, and it will satisfy you. It won't always be easy. In fact, it'll be very, very hard, but it will be there and be available. You know, maybe you've heard me tell this story before, and I apologize, but it's illustrative. I started off by telling a water story of me on a river. But maybe you've heard this story before about the flotilla of Navy ships crossing the North Atlantic, where the Navy ships are crossing on a very dark and foggy night, and right and directly in their path is a light. And the captain of the ship signals ahead and says, "Change your course 15 degrees to the south to avoid a collision." And the light responds back and says, "Nope, you move 15 degrees to the north to avoid a collision." And the captain's a little upset because of the informality. He says, "No, I direct you to change your course 15 degrees to the south to avoid a collision. Please confirm." And the voice says, "Nope, you got to move. You guys go 15 degrees to the north and you'll be safe." Now the captain is insulted. He says, "This is the captain of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the second largest ship in the US North Atlantic Fleet. I am accompanied by 5 destroyers and numerous support vessels. And if you do not change your course 15 degrees, that's 15 degrees to the south, to avoid a collision, countermeasures will be undertaken to ensure the safety of this vessel. Please confirm." Slight pause, and the guy says back, "This is a lighthouse, your call." The whole idea, of course, is that though this thing seemed like it's so powerful, it's just floating. There's no foundation to it whatsoever. A single light can defy what seems so powerful, and the culture of confusion seems incredibly powerful. But you're not here to defy the culture of confusion. Like the lighthouse, the single lighthouse, you are there to shine your light, to keep the culture of confusion from destroying itself. Your purpose is not to defy the culture of confusion. Your purpose is to bring clarity to the culture of confusion so it doesn't destroy itself. Because in Christ, who sets you free, you can offer them the message of the Son, the light of the world, who can set them free too. Thank you, guys. God bless you. I think we're going to have about 5 minutes or so for questions. Questions from what I talked about, or basically anything that's on your mind, even from the week during classes and stuff. I'd be happy to answer your questions. So just raise your hand high, and we'll go for it. Now's the time. Anybody? Was my thing so clear, haha, that there's no confusion left? You good? Oh, there's one. Sorry, right there.
Okay, so a couple of times during your speech, you mentioned UC Berkeley. Yeah. So for a second, try to put yourself in my shoes. I'm a Black woman. The speaker has called women like me apes. He said many racist comments, like he's a racist, a bigot, a bully. So my question is, shouldn't bullies have a boundary on their freedom of speech?
Shouldn't they have a boundary on freedom of speech?
Yeah.
Let me answer a couple of things on that. Great question, amazing question. A couple of things. First, I've never heard him actually speak, so I don't know what he says. The whole point of the freedom of the speech is, if you look at all the jurisprudence on freedom of speech throughout the United States, on the First Amendment, the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law, and basically goes on to some things and says, suppressing the freedom of speech, or the right of freedom of the press as well. The whole point of freedom of speech is to allow unpopular speech to be said so that people can counter ugliness. And if he said those things, they're obviously ugly. They're obviously sick and wrong. You're not to counter it with force. You are to counter it with truth and these ideals. So free speech allows those who harbor ugly feelings to be, first of all, you get to know who they are. They're not hiding in secret somewhere. That's the first thing. Second thing is that you actually get to counter their speech with, I think, grace and beauty and dignity, and show them that the reality is that this is something different than what they're offering. I think this has been the hallmark of the civil rights movement's major achievements. It's not the forcible suppression of other people, but it has been the, what did Martin Luther King call it? Absolute truth and unconditional love being expressed through a thing that's got far more dignity than someone's loud yelling of obscenities. Those things might win a few people, but the counter perspective is to offer truth and beauty and love in a way that does that. If you forcibly suppress other people's speech, the problem with this is that it becomes when your speech becomes unpopular, can they do that with you too? Can they put boundaries on what you say? And that's a hard thing. The line becomes very, very blurry. Legally speaking, that's why the Supreme Court over the past 200 years has wrestled with this, because what happens is the mob gets to decide what it likes. And historically speaking, the mob has been very, very bad at that. That's exactly what people did with the civil rights movement. They suppressed the wonderful things that were happening in the civil rights movement through violence and through force. So the answer to your question is this. Legally speaking, absent inciting insurrection or violence, there can't be limits on free speech. Morally speaking, of course there are. Of course there are. It's wrong to say the things that you're saying. Legally speaking, we have to allow people to say unpopular things. That's how things get changed for the better. The whole civil rights movement worked because it defied those who were trying to use force to shut them up. And it worked beautifully.
Okay, I'm not condoning the violence, but okay, that's fine.
Yeah, and to be clear on it, the whole point of the Berkeley thing is, if you have a protest outside someone's event, by all means, of course. It's when people resort to the violence that's happened, and this is what's happened. I think the culture of confusion has resulted in this thing where we forgot that it was peaceful protests that changed things, and now we're so angry all the time because we're a law unto ourselves that we can do whatever we want. So your point is very well taken. I absolutely 100% appreciate your point. Violence will never get you there. Peaceful protests, if they're done with the right spirit, and I think they're done right, that changes things. The problem with the Berkeley situation is that it is antithetical to the very free speech that they fostered in the first place. And we're murdering, in many ways, our legacy. Our legacy of freedom was born by people who protested peacefully and in a nonviolent way, and that changed hearts and minds. I very much worry that in our current climate, we're losing our soul.
Okay. In 2016, they tried to petition him from not going there. They tried peaceful protests, but it didn't work out. He said many racist comments in that time. So what do you think people are going to resort to when they're not heard the first time?
Should it be violence?
No, it shouldn't be violence, but
right.
Like our voices are not.
Yeah, well, I go back to the two paradigmatic movements. When you see the movements of Gandhi, the nonviolent movements of Gandhi in India, they weren't heard the first time, second time, third time, fifth time, 25th time. They weren't heard then either. William Wilberforce abolished the slave trade over 20 years. He kept on saying it over and over again. This is immoral, it's immoral, it's immoral. And they didn't listen to him until they did. So I think that's what it is. You have to keep at it. You keep that sense of value within you. And if it means self-sacrifice of comfort or whatever it is, it's going to mean that. But hearts and minds can change. I think over time, if they see that sense of self-sacrifice in you and in your generation is the one that's going to have to fix it. I'll tell you this, my generation in large ways has failed you. In large ways has failed you. In some ways has actually helped you. But in some ways we failed. But your generation now has the mantle. If you don't step up as a generation and do it right, I'm not sure what hope there is. I have a 12-year-old son, a 10-year-old girl, and an 8-year-old girl. I want the end of sexism in my time. I would love to see that for my girl's sake. I would love to see my son know what it means to treat somebody of a different race in a way that's respectful. I hope I've instilled that in them. His generation now depends on yours. As yours depended on mine, his depends on yours. So I think this is an incredibly important question you're asking. Is it an easy road? It's not. But in our microwave society, we want the fast way to effectuate change. And the fast way is not going to work. It's going to be a terrible consequence if we do that. It's a wonderful question. Just keep up the fight in terms of that proclaiming truth. And if you need to do it ultimately in a nonviolent way, that's the way to get it, to make the real change happen. We have to live up to that legacy from before. You're not advocating it. I appreciate that. I understand it. But it's very frustrating. I can understand that as well. That if change doesn't happen fast enough, then there's serious problems. But I do have that hope that if we spread the gospel, and this goes back to the gospel message, if someone like that, okay, someone who says these ugly things, can be convinced in their heart and mind that you and I, as different as we might be, bear that same imago Dei, that image of God, and if he truly believes that, and you change his heart with that, not by shutting him up, but by talking to him, I think things really do fundamentally change. I saw that happen 2 weeks ago in Montreal, where LGBT activists came and talked to us about biblical sexuality. And it was an amazing event because people walked out of there so surprised because they talked to each other about the value that Christianity fosters in people. Does everyone agree with that? No, of course they don't. But it's our job to proclaim it, and I think to do it credibly, and that can win the day. It's an excellent question. Thank you.